For this video, I'm going to be talking about inflammation. And everyone's got some kind of inflammation. Most of the time, any symptom that you have is usually based on some type of inflammatory process. Inflammation in its truest state is really an attempt by the body to repair itself. So it's an experience of some kind of threat to normal function, and the body produces stress hormones and inflammatory markers to counter this, to repair, to fix what's going on. The problem is when the inflammatory process is sustained for too long, and what the outcome, I guess, the worst part of it is that it impairs normal function. So what was initially a threat and damage, which the body's trying to innately repair, now your body's gone into a chronic state of inflammation and producing these proteins that are now trying to fix something, but is actually kind of getting in the way of the body performing as it's supposed to. A very simple, good example might be like arthritis, for example. Arthritis can sometimes occur at the site of an injury in a joint, and the knee swells, for example. Let's say you twist your knee or you do some kind of ligament damage, swells, it's inflamed. The body's trying to send these markers, immune markers, to either fix, remove damage, enhance blood flow, with some type of attempt to repair and secure the structures that are irritated, damaged, broken, whatever. And that's a temporary issue usually. What happens if you re-injure it? Or what happens if the body doesn't know to shut off that inflammatory state? That knee is going to act up from time to time. And sometimes it is chronically inflamed, which will then over time lead to increased degradation and weakness, and loss of structural stability. Now we got a problem because the body doesn't know when to shut off this inflammatory state. And there's a lot of reasons and justifications why it's happening. Sometimes it just does it. For some reason, the body gets addicted to sending inflammatory markers to part of the body. Sometimes there are other factors. I mean, stress is sort of the most common culprit for everything. When your cortisol is high, you tend to have high inflammatory markers, and vice versa. They sort of feed off each other. And again, that initial release of inflammatory markers and release of cortisol is a good thing. Your body is supposed to be doing that. It's a problem when it's becoming a sustained chronic state and your body doesn't know how to shut it off. Another factor that can lend itself to perpetuating this chronic inflammatory state is digestive health. And really, that I think is probably the most overlooked, but the most common trigger for inflammation in the body. And despite it just being initially targeted in the digestive tract itself, chronic digestive inflammation leads to systemic inflammation. Now, some people will be like, well, I don't understand. What does that have to do with anything? If you're not digesting your food well, whether you consider it a sensitivity or consuming foods that are higher in terms of the inflammatory response that it may create, ultimately, your immune cells that are being activated in the gut, they are not exclusively limited to the gut. They will get into circulation. Let's say you've got an antibody to some protein. Maybe it's a food. But there's homology, meaning sometimes proteins look similar. And if there's a partial match, your antibodies will start to attack other proteins in the body that have a similar structure. This is one of the most common explanations for autoimmune diseases, is that, by chance, maybe genetic disposition, there's antibodies attacking your cells for some reason, or your structures, your proteins. Now, what do we do with this information? So some people, they'll go on like an anti-inflammatory diet with that premise being that I'm going to limit the foods that I'm consuming, which will most likely increase my burden of inflammation. So giving a reprieve to the gut so that your digestive health can heal and minimize that aggravation of your immune cells, spiking an inflammatory response that becomes a systemic response. That's one method and one component. And I think it's good to actually recognize what foods can be inflammatory. Food sensitivities can have or mimic an inflammatory response. Certain foods in general, when consumed in large volumes and or not in the right state, speaking to things that have like lectins, food that's not ripened appropriately, maybe some genetically modified foods, some foods that have other components attached to it, like a pesticide count, for example. This toxic burden is also leading to more gut inflammation, which then my premise is that it becomes systemic inflammation. Another issue, and I would talk about this often, is that most people don't digest proteins well in general. And that boils down to a lack of stomach acid and enzyme activity. So to reduce the burden of gut inflammation, I always encourage the use of digestive enzymes or betaine HCl to enhance the function of the stomach to ensure that we're digesting protein more effectively, thus reducing the likelihood of inflammation being triggered in the gut. So in a very simplified manner, total body inflammation can be reduced by focusing on reduction of gut inflammation. Cutting out foods that are going to trigger your inflammation, enhancing your digestive ability to break down proteins at the level of the stomach more effectively, thus giving your intestines less work to do, less immune cell activation, less antibody load, and then a reduction in overall inflammatory markers that are becoming, a problem, because every time you eat, you somehow re-aggravate and reignite that response. There's that. I also think that there's a mental component to inflammation, and maybe I'll just chalk it up to, or simplify it to, mental stress and overthinking and overstimulation of the mind, whether that is directly increasing cortisol or creating a more acidic environment internally, will obviously lend itself towards inflammation. I have like just a general phrase I use with people: inflammation is acidity, and acidity is inflammation. So when your body is acidic, you will have the aggravation and symptoms of inflammation. Alkalinizing your body, and there's so many different methods that we can get into, that has a way of neutralizing this acidity or inflammation. So some things to consider: lemon water, alkaline water, increased vegetation in your diet, minimizing acidic or acidifying foods and drinks. There's a million of them out there. Watching your glycemic load, keeping that within a tight watch. But cooked greens are a good way to help alkalinize. Also, mineral replacement. A lot of people they'll use Celtic salt or they'll take a multi-mineral supplement, or they make their sort of own homemade lemonade, Gatorade, like 0 sugar, but like some good balance of minerals. Oh, bone broth. That would probably even be the best dietary source of alkalinity and mineral replacement, because one part of acidity is that because our pH in our blood has to be very, very tightly regulated, if we have a high acidic burden, our blood is going to try to neutralize any shifts in pH by leaching minerals from our bones and our tissues to help balance that pH balance. So a net loss of minerals is the outcome of a chronic acidic state. And I see that with people who overthink, with people who overtrain, people who don't sleep well, people who have a low vegetable intake. And again, with people who have low protein degradation, they can't break down and assimilate protein well, leading to that gut inflammation from sensitivities or a greater burden on the intestinal tract to process the foods. So this was in a nutshell inflammation, some of the causes, and some of the ways that we can neutralize its effects. See you next time.